put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Princess Who Stole a Nation. In 2013, Forbes magazine announced something extraordinary. Africa had its first female billionaire. Her name was Isabel dos Santos, daughter of Angola's president, and her estimated fortune of $3 billion made headlines across the world. The narrative was irresistible. A self-made African woman who had conquered the male-dominated world of international business through sheer brilliance and determination. But in the shadows of Luanda's glittering skyscrapers, in the slums where children died from preventable diseases, in the unmarked graves of journalists who asked too many questions, a different story was being written. A story of systematic looting so brazen, so sophisticated, that it would drain billions from one of the poorest nations on earth, while the world applauded. This is not a story about business success. This is a story about the perfect crime, committed in plain sight, disguised as entrepreneurship. Angola in the late 1970s was a nation drowning in blood. Portuguese colonial rule had collapsed, leaving behind a power vacuum that erupted into one of the Cold War's most brutal proxy conflicts. Into this chaos, José Eduardo dos Santos seized control, backed by Soviet weapons and Cuban soldiers. He would rule Angola for 38 years, transforming a country rich in oil and diamonds into his personal treasury. And his daughter Isabel, born in 1973, would become the instrument through which billions would be extracted, laundered, and hidden across the globe. But here's what the business magazines never mentioned. Isabel's empire wasn't built in boardrooms through competitive bids and innovative strategies. It was built through presidential decrees, state asset transfers, and a network of shell companies so complex that it took years for investigators to unravel. The formula was elegant in its simplicity. First, Isabel would express interest in entering a particular sector of Angola's economy: telecommunications, banking, cement production, diamonds. Then, as if by magic, government regulations would shift in her favor. State contracts would materialize. Competitors would face sudden regulatory obstacles or find their licenses mysteriously revoked. By 2013, Isabel dos Santos held stakes in virtually every major industry in Angola. She controlled the country's dominant mobile phone network, its largest cement producer, its primary cable television provider, and significant portions of its banking sector. On paper, this looked like the portfolio of a brilliant entrepreneur. In reality, it was the systematic monopolization of an entire nation's economy by a single family. Consider the case of Unitel, Angola's largest mobile telecommunications company. In the late 1990s, as mobile technology was revolutionizing Africa, Isabel acquired a 25% stake in what would become Angola's most profitable company. The official narrative claimed she had invested wisely, taken risks, built something from nothing. But leaked documents would later reveal a darker truth. Her stake was acquired through a complex web of companies registered in tax havens, using funds that appeared to originate from Angolan state accounts. She hadn't built Unitel. She had been gifted a license to print money, protected by presidential power, insulated from competition by governmental decree. The company would generate hundreds of millions in annual profits, while ordinary Angolans paid some of the highest mobile phone rates in the world. But Isabel dos Santos understood something crucial about modern wealth. You cannot simply steal billions and keep them in your home country. The money must be moved, cleaned, legitimized through the machinery of international finance. And so began one of history's most sophisticated laundering operations, utilizing the world's most respected banks, prestigious consulting firms, and elite law offices. Money extracted from Angola's state coffers would flow through shell companies in Malta, Dubai, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. From there, it would be invested in Portuguese banks, British real estate, Swiss art collections, and luxury properties across Europe. The Western financial system, supposedly protected by anti-money laundering regulations and due diligence requirements, became the enabler of Africa's largest kleptocracy. In 2016, Isabel dos Santos achieved what seemed like her greatest triumph. Her father, still Angola's president, appointed her chairman of Sonangol, the state oil company that generated 90% of Angola's export revenue. This wasn't just any corporate position. Sonangol was Angola itself, the beating heart of the national economy, controlling billions in oil revenues that should have lifted millions out of poverty. Isabel promised reform, modernization, transparency. International media praised the appointment as a sign of progressive change. Behind closed doors, something very different was happening. What investigators would later discover about Isabel's 18 months at Sonangol represents corporate theft on a scale that defies comprehension. Within days of her appointment, she began awarding contracts worth hundreds of millions to companies she secretly controlled. A consulting contract for $135 million went to a firm that had been incorporated just months earlier, with no track record, no expertise in oil and gas, and no employees beyond a few administrators. The company was registered in Malta, controlled through nominee directors, but ultimately owned by Isabel herself through a labyrinth of shell entities. This wasn't business. This was naked theft dressed in the language of corporate governance. But the consulting contract was merely the appetizer. Isabel systematically diverted Sonangol funds through a network of at least 400 companies spread across 33 countries. Money that should have built hospitals, schools, and water systems in one of the world's poorest nations instead flowed into luxury real estate in London, Lisbon, and Monaco. She purchased a 9-bedroom mansion in London's Kensington neighbourhood for £26 million. She acquired a stake in Portugal's largest bank, using funds traced directly to Sonangol accounts. She bought a yacht, an art collection worth millions, and a Swiss ski chalet, all while 60% of Angolans lived on less than $2 a day. The audacity was breathtaking. Isabel didn't just steal, she stole while positioning herself as a champion of African entrepreneurship and women's empowerment. She gave TED Talks about leadership. She appeared on panels at Davos discussing economic development. She was profiled in glossy magazines as a role model for aspiring businesswomen across the continent. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Here was a woman celebrated globally for business acumen, while simultaneously orchestrating the systematic impoverishment of her own people. But Isabel understood a fundamental truth about the international elite. They desperately wanted to believe in her story, because believing made them feel progressive, forward-thinking, post-colonial. Nobody asked difficult questions when the answers might be uncomfortable. Meanwhile, in Angola, people died from lack of clean water, while Isabel purchased champagne, worth more than an average Angolan earned in a lifetime. Children succumbed to malaria and diarrhea, diseases easily preventable with resources that were instead financing European shopping sprees. The nation's healthcare system crumbled as doctors fled abroad, unpaid for months, while Isabel's companies siphoned millions from state accounts. This is the mathematics of kleptocracy. Every dollar stolen represents medicine unbought, infrastructure unbuilt, futures destroyed. Isabel dos Santos didn't just accumulate wealth, she accumulated it by methodically draining the life from one of Africa's richest nations in natural resources. But in 2017, something unexpected happened that would begin Isabel's unraveling. Her father, after 38 years in power, finally stepped down as Angola's president. His chosen successor, João Lourenço, was expected to continue the family's dominance. Instead, Lourenço did something almost unthinkable in African politics. he turned against his predecessor and launched anti-corruption investigations. Within months, Isabel was fired from Sonangol. Her assets in Angola were frozen, and prosecutors began the painstaking work of tracing her financial empire across dozens of jurisdictions. Isabel fled to London, then Dubai, maintaining her innocence, claiming persecution, insisting everything she owned had been earned through legitimate business. In January 2020, the truth detonated across international headlines. A coalition of journalists released the Luanda leaks, over 700,000 leaked documents exposing the intricate mechanisms of Isabel's empire. The cache included emails, bank transfers, corporate records, and internal communications from consulting firms and banks that had facilitated the looting. What emerged was a masterclass in modern financial crime, revealing exactly how the international financial system enables kleptocracy. The leaked documents revealed something more disturbing than Isabel's theft itself: the enthusiastic participation of Western institutions that should have prevented it. PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the world's Big Four accounting firms, had provided consulting services that helped structure Isabel's web of companies. Boston Consulting Group had been paid millions for advice on Sonangol restructuring, while Isabel was actively looting the company. Portugal's largest bank, in which Isabel was the largest individual shareholder, had received emergency capital from the Portuguese government. Taxpayer money, propping up an institution, being used to launder stolen Angolan wealth. This wasn't incompetence or oversight. These were sophisticated financial institutions making conscious decisions to profit from corruption because the fees were too lucrative to refuse. The leaked emails were particularly damning. They showed consultants and bankers discussing Isabel's political connections with full awareness that her wealth originated from her father's position. They revealed internal concerns about reputational risk, followed by decisions to proceed anyway after calculating the profit potential. One email chain discussed how to structure transactions to avoid triggering anti-money laundering alerts. Another detailed strategies for moving money through jurisdictions with weak regulatory oversight. These weren't crimes of ignorance. They were deliberate conspiracies between African kleptocrats and Western financial professionals who knew exactly what they were facilitating. The scale was staggering. Investigators traced over $2 billion in suspicious transactions linked to Isabel's network of companies. But that figure likely represents only a fraction of the total theft, as the most sophisticated schemes remain hidden behind nominee directors, encrypted communications, and jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate with investigations. Angola's Attorney General estimated the total damage to the nation at over $5 billion. Money that could have transformed healthcare, education, and infrastructure for millions of people. Isabel's response to the exposé was predictable. She claimed political persecution, argued that all accusations were fabricated, insisted she was being targeted because she was a successful African woman challenging patriarchal power structures. It was a brilliant rhetorical move, weaponizing legitimate concerns about colonialism and sexism to deflect from documented financial crimes. Some observers, desperate to believe in her narrative of entrepreneurial success, accepted these explanations. But the documents spoke clearly. This was theft, systematic and massive, enabled by international institutions that prioritized profit over ethics. Since the Luanda leaks, Isabel has lived in exile, primarily in Dubai, one of the few jurisdictions unlikely to extradite her to Angola. Angolan authorities have frozen over $1 billion in assets, but much of her wealth remains beyond reach, hidden in corporate structures designed specifically to be impenetrable. Portuguese authorities have frozen bank accounts and seized properties, but recovery efforts move slowly through international legal systems designed to protect capital, not victims of theft. Meanwhile, Angola remains one of the world's most unequal societies, where oil wealth continues to enrich a tiny elite, while the majority struggle with poverty that should be unthinkable in a resource-rich nation. The business lessons from Isabel dos Santos' empire are dark but essential. First, understand that what appears to be entrepreneurial success may actually be politically enabled monopolization. When someone accumulates wealth impossibly fast in sectors requiring government licenses or state contracts, ask what invisible hands are tilting the playing field. Second, recognize that the international financial system actively facilitates corruption through willful blindness. Banks, consulting firms, and law offices profit enormously from not asking questions, from accepting implausible explanations, from prioritizing client relationships over ethical obligations. Third, appreciate the sophistication of modern money laundering, which exploits legitimate corporate structures, tax havens, and jurisdictional complexity to make stolen wealth indistinguishable from legal assets. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological: how easily we accept narratives that confirm what we want to believe. The world wanted to believe in Isabel dos Santos because her story was inspiring. A self-made African billionaire, a woman succeeding in male-dominated industries, proof that the continent could produce homegrown business titans. This desire for an uplifting narrative blinded journalists, investors, and institutions to obvious red flags that should have triggered scrutiny. Critical thinking was abandoned in favor of inspirational storytelling, and that collective failure enabled billions to be stolen, while the thief was celebrated on magazine covers. The human cost of Isabel's empire cannot be calculated in dollars alone. Every diverted contract represented doctors unpaid, leaving hospitals understaffed during medical emergencies. Every laundered million meant schools without books, water systems unbuilt, vaccination programs unfunded. While Isabel purchased art and yachts, Angolan mothers watched children die from preventable diseases. While she collected luxury properties across Europe, families in Luanda's slums lived without electricity or clean water. This is not an abstract crime of financial manipulation. It is violence enacted through spreadsheets and shell companies, murder committed via consulting contracts. Today, Isabel dos Santos maintains her innocence from exile, protected by jurisdictions that shelter wealth regardless of origin. She continues to claim persecution, to insist that her empire was built legitimately, to position herself as a victim of political rivals rather than a perpetrator of massive theft. And in some circles, this narrative still finds purchase, because admitting the truth requires acknowledging how completely the international financial system failed, how thoroughly respected institutions enabled corruption, how easily the machinery of global capitalism can be hijacked by kleptocrats. The broader implications extend far beyond Angola. Isabel's case reveals how wealth extraction from developing nations continues under new forms, no longer through colonial administration, but through financial complexity that achieves the same result. Resources are extracted, wealth is transferred to Western financial centers, and poverty persists in nations that should be prosperous. The mechanisms have changed, from gunboats to shell companies, but the underlying dynamic remains: systematic enrichment of global elites at the expense of ordinary people in resource-rich nations. For anyone building a business, the Isabel dos Santos story offers a stark reminder about the foundations of legitimate success. Real entrepreneurship creates value, solves problems, serves customers who choose your products in competitive markets. It doesn't require presidential decrees, state asset transfers, or regulatory capture. It doesn't need networks of shell companies to hide ownership or tax havens to obscure money flows. Legitimate wealth can be explained, defended, traced to actual value creation rather than political connections. When someone's fortune requires constant explanation, legal challenges, and asset hiding. That's not business success. It's organized theft wearing a business suit. The investigation continues, with authorities in multiple jurisdictions working to trace assets, freeze accounts, and potentially recover stolen wealth. But even if every dollar were recovered, which is impossible given the sophistication of the laundering, the damage cannot be truly repaired. You cannot resurrect children who died from preventable diseases while healthcare funds were diverted. You cannot restore years of education lost when school construction money financed luxury shopping. You cannot compensate for decades of stolen potential, for an entire generation robbed of the opportunities that Angola's resource wealth should have provided. In the end, Isabel dos Santos' empire stands as a monument to a particular kind of modern corruption, sophisticated enough to exploit international financial systems, brazen enough to occur in plain sight, and destructive enough to devastate a nation. She was never Africa's richest woman through business acumen or entrepreneurial brilliance. She was Africa's most successful thief, enabled by a father's presidential power and a global financial system willing to profit from looking the other way. The empire she built wasn't constructed from innovation or competitive advantage. It was assembled from stolen state assets, laundered through Western banks, and protected by the same institutions that preach corporate governance and ethical business practices. And here's the final, chilling truth that keeps investigators working late into the night. Isabel dos Santos likely represents not an aberration, but a template. Across the developing world, political elites watched her accumulate billions while being celebrated by international media and legitimate institutions. They observed how easily Western banks would accept their deposits, how willing consulting firms were to provide services, how effectively shell companies could hide ownership. The lesson wasn't that corruption doesn't pay. It was that corruption, if sophisticated enough and connected to sufficient power, can generate billions while you're applauded as an entrepreneur. Isabel's true legacy may not be the wealth she stole, but the blueprint she created for others to follow. So when you hear stories of self-made billionaires from nations with weak institutions and strong natural resource wealth, remember the princess of plunder. Remember that behind the inspirational narrative might lie systematic theft dressed in the language of business success. Remember that the international financial system designed to prevent exactly this kind of looting instead profits from facilitating it. And remember that every dollar accumulated through corruption represents not just wealth transferred, but futures destroyed, lives shortened, and potential extinguished in nations that deserved so much better. The file on Isabel dos Santos remains open, the investigations ongoing, the stolen billions still hidden across dozens of jurisdictions. But one thing is already certain. This was never a story about Africa's richest woman building an empire through brilliance and determination. This was always a story about the perfect crime, committed with the unwitting assistance of those who should have prevented it, celebrated by those who should have investigated it, and defended by those who profited from enabling it. The mystery announced at the beginning has been solved, but the theft continues, protected by financial complexity and international borders, a monument to greed's ability to disguise itself as success. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.